People say, wait a minute, how could the world flood? Could it rain enough to cover Mount Everest? I was in a debate one time, and this skeptic stood up, and he said, Hovind, do you realize when it rains, it releases heat into the atmosphere? I said, yes, sir, I taught physics. It's called the latent heat of condensation. What's your question? He said, well, if it rained enough to cover Mount Everest, the heat would cook the entire world. I said, you are exactly right. He said, but don't you think it rained enough to cover Mount Everest? I said, no, I've never said that. He said, well, do you think Mount Everest was covered? I said, well, I don't think Mount Everest was there. I don't think the mountains even formed till late in the flood. The Bible covers that in Psalm 104. We'll get into that later when we talk about the mountain ranges forming on this planet. But no, I don't think it rained enough to cover Mount Everest. I don't know any Christians that teach that. I think what happened was the whole world was covered with water, but the water didn't come from rain. Very little water for the flood came from rain. So they build up this straw man that if it rained enough to cover Mount Everest, it would cook the world, and that's correct, but it's an artificial argument. That's not where the water came from. I believe the earth broke up at the time of the flood, and we still have the scars all over the planet where this happened. They're called fault lines. I lived right by the San Andreas Fault. I've studied the Hayward Fault, the New Madrid Fault, the Golden Fault. None of them are my fault, but I've studied them, okay? There's no question the earth is busted up into plates, and there's no question these plates are moving. And when they move, it causes tsunamis and earthquakes and volcanoes. There's no question that stuff happens. The question is, when did this happen to the earth? I think it happened about 400 years ago at the very beginning of the flood. And evolutionists will say, so, well, don't you see that's proof of Pangaea? These continents fit together. Can't you see how South America and Africa seem to be a fit? Well, yeah, now hold on a minute. How many have ever heard of Pangaea? They teach us in the textbooks like some kind of fact, all the continents used to fit together. I say, guys, now wait a minute. There's a couple things you ought to consider about this Pangaea theory before you get too excited. First of all, they'll say South America and Africa seem to fit. Yeah, my house and the neighbor's house would fit too if you slid them together. What does that prove? Nothing. It doesn't prove the street oozed up in between them and the houses slid apart, okay? It's a pure coincidence. The shape of these continents is an absolute pure coincidence based upon the water level. The evidence they use for continental drift is interesting. They'll say the shapes of the continents seem to fit. Similar fossils are found on opposite sides of the ocean. Well, that may be true. But it's also true those same fossils are found literally all over the world. Those fossils found all over the world is just as much evidence of a flood. I mean, a worldwide flood, how far could the dead animals float around? Quite a ways, right? And then they'll say there are magnetic reversals in the mid-Atlantic ridge. Well, now hold on a minute. They don't tell you they shrank Africa nearly 35 or 40% to make them fit, do they? They don't tell you that Mexico and Central America are gone. Hey, señor, ¿qué pasa? ¿Dónde está Mexico, Panama, Costa Rica, Guatemala? They don't tell you that Europe and South America were rotated counterclockwise and Africa was rotated clockwise to make them fit. And they also don't tell you what I think ought to be obvious to a kindergartner. Did you know if you took the water out of the oceans, you would notice there is dirt underneath? I mean, the oceans actually have a bottom to them. How many knew that already, okay? I mean, they do have a bottom, okay? So people say, do you think the continents were ever connected? I say, well, duh, they're still connected right now. What do you mean, were they connected? Hello, they're still connected. They've always been connected. The earth has a crust. Under the low places are full of water, I understand, okay? But textbooks say, well, yes, there are magnetic reversals at the bottom of this mid-Atlantic ridge. Well, that's simply baloney, okay? There are no reversed polarity areas unless it's where rocks flipped over when the fountains of the deep broke open. That may have happened in some areas. But this is a lie, talking about magnetic reversals. Even one author wrote in a book, Deep Crustal Drilling in the North Atlantic Ocean, Science Magazine, Volume 204, he said, it's clear the simple model of uniformly magnetized crustal blocks of alternating polarity does not represent reality. What they show you in your textbooks is not reality. No, there are no magnetic reversals, only stronger and weaker magnetism. It's actually a jumbled up mess down there at the mid-Atlantic ridge. See, the earth has lost 10% of its magnetic strength in the last 150 years. It's lost 40% of its strength in the last 1,000 years. It's pretty overwhelming evidence that the earth's magnetic field is getting weaker. What does that mean? Well, that means it used to be stronger. And if the earth's magnetic field is getting weaker, this creates a problem, because if you go back in time about 25,000 years, the magnetic strength would have been too great for life to exist here because of the heat generated. And so the evolutionists have to find an answer for the problem. Hey, we're watching the magnetic field decline, so it must be going through reversals. It has never been observed to reverse. It's only been observed to decline.